Hello, everyone. Hello, people in the room and those on Zoom. Welcome to the second night of the 2023 Rosenbach lectures with Leah Price, reading from home. My name's Lynne Farrington. I'm the Director of Programs and Senior Curator here in the Kislak Center, which is a center of material text. As our today's introducer of our speaker, Whitney Trettien, knows very well. Whitney is an assistant professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, but she also often fills this room with her students, set up with lots of books and other things for them to look at. So it's always, and she's here quite regularly to do all kinds of things with us. So it's wonderful to have her here tonight to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Lynne. The first wave of book history turned our attention from authors and their texts to printers or scribes and their books, that is, to the labor of making material text. A second wave drew that attention from the material text outward to readers and book use, taking up questions of reception and circulation. But where within the circuit of communication from author to printer to reader back to publisher can we find the infrastructural supports, both manual and material, that made possible all this printing and writing and reading and making of books? This is the question that I didn't even know I should be asking until Professor Leah Price's first Rosenbach lecture last night, titled Bibliodomesticity: Who Served Victorian Books? Broadening book history's archive, Professor Price helped us see the servants' hands that rubbed oil on the covers of their master's books, beating and dusting them yearly. The candles that needed making and trimming to keep their readers reading, the floors that required scrubbing to keep paper and glue-loving insects out of libraries. And she gave us a real sense for the people doing this work and for their unique relationship to books as objects that might distract, distress, or in the many household manuals smugly gifted from masters to their servants, simply bore. In doing so, she showed us that books are, quote, like fossils that quantify the labor of servants. And just as our collective consumption of fossil fuels has demanded a new environmental humanities, these fossil books in libraries may require what she called a carbon bibliography to track all the energy that goes into making and, more significantly, preserving books. This is a turn away from materiality and toward the language of maintenance and repair. Tonight's lecture promises to build on this argument, but before we get to it, I'd like to say a few more words by way of introduction about Professor Price's work in general. Leah Price is, of course, distinguished professor at Rutgers University and founding director of its initiative for the book. In yesterday's introduction, Jerry mentioned Professor Price's two most recent award-winning monographs, her highly acclaimed How to Do Things with Books in Victorian Britain, published by Princeton University Press in 2012, and What We Talk About When We Talk About Books, The History and Future of Reading, published in 2019 by Basic Books. Together, these gratifying declarative and directive titles point us to the space that Professor Price's work has opened up for the rest of us within the field. That is, she is continually showing us that books are both mundane household objects to which things are done, even as their objectness is always being undone by the many reading, writing, and publishing practices that they support. It turns out what we talk about when we talk about books is historically available to us, but not always consistent or stable. But I wanted to draw further attention to her field-defining collaborations. With Matthew Rubery, Professor Price has co-edited the collection Further Reading out in 2020 with Oxford University Press. Through sharp, succinct chapters, each titled with a phrase that defines reading, like not reading, technical reading, or post-critical reading, Further Reading has brilliantly captured the curiosity and playfulness currently animating the history of reading and histories of media more generally. She's also, with Seth Lehrer, the co-editor of a cluster of PMLA essays on the history of the book and the idea of literature that, while published in 2006, remains a touchstone for many of us, having defined the sometimes fraught, often productive relationship between the material text, literature, and literary theory. Through her more recent work as founding director of the Rutgers Book Initiative, Professor Price has invigorated the greater Philadelphia book scene. We're so thrilled to have her in this area, bringing exciting speakers, bookmaking classes, and exhibitions while generating a new community of fellow biblio-nerds at Rutgers itself. I'm thrilled to be here to introduce Professor Price tonight for her second lecture in the Rosenbach Lecture Series, Reading from Home. Tonight's lecture is titled Proxy Print: How Tracts Made Masters. Please join me in welcoming again Professor Price.
Thank you so much, Whitney, for that generous introduction. and for pronouncing biblio-nerds so clearly when yesterday we all struggled with auto-bibliography. And thank you also to Lynne Farrington, both for introducing Whitney and for making this whole event possible. I'm especially grateful to have your introduction tonight, Whitney, because your own book, Cut, Copy, Paste, is to use one of your words, a touchstone for me in thinking about the texts that I'm talking about today as products of a kind of unsettled combination of composition and assemblage in ways that I'm not going to focus on tonight, but that I think will certainly be clear to you, if not to others in the room. There's a household manual that I won't talk about by the wonderfully named William Kitchener, who announces in the preface that the scissors and paste have more often been used in the making of this book than pen and ink. And the way he goes from the space of the desk to the space of that more homely making, for me really resonates with some of your work. With apologies to people who were here yesterday, I am once again going to make a prepared statement to the effect that the strike at the Rutgers AAUP AFT, which began yesterday, is still ongoing today. Once again, I do have the union's blessing to be here rather than on the picket. But once again, I do want to register that we are striking for living wages for all graduate workers and contingent faculty. And to say again that the honorarium for these lectures goes to the strike fund. So thank you, Mr. Rosenbach. And thank you to Penn. And please feel free to come up after the lecture if you'd like to learn more about the strike. One more parenthesis before we start. If anyone in the back would be willing to come to the front. You have all been at the front of a room with a vast sea of chairs between you and the people at the back. It would be much appreciated. Okay, and that is so kind of you, thanks. End of logistical parentheses. So after yesterday's lecture, someone in this who was in the room then and is in the room again now said to me very politely, it was so interesting hearing about master's reading, I guess, but I'm just really glad that tomorrow you're going to finally be talking about servants reading. I'm not really going to be talking about servants reading today. I too wish that I could talk about that, but for reasons that you can probably imagine even before I describe them, that is very hard to pin down. So I'm not going to be talking primarily about servants' own reading, but I will be talking today about servants' own owning of books and tracts. And I will be talking about the relation between servants' owning of tracts and mistresses' pre-reading or proxy reading of these tracts. So what are the objects I'm talking about? These are produced by Victorian evangelical publishers in gigantic quantities before being, as you can see here, inscribed. The vast majority of these in library collections now have either some kind of reward sticker with an inscription or some kind of inscription directly on the front paste down. Some of them are bound together. This is a particularly odd object with it's the same image is on the front cover as on the back cover, and it's a collection of tracts, reprinted, microformed, and digitized. Very few of them, on the other hand, show signs of use, and even once you get beyond the front paste down, and even fewer of them provide any incentive for scholars to change that fact. My first place, her first place, Jenny's first place, Lucy Bell's first place, Mary's first place, young Susan's first place, Lizzie Andrews's first place. Unlike counterparts for sailors or cobblers, these stab-stitched pamphlets and gilt-stamped reward books cohabited in the same households with 3-volume novels. And just another parenthesis, the examples that I'll show you are primarily reward books, simply because, for obvious reasons, those have survived in greater numbers than the loose pamphlets. Because both genres passed through the same hands, each can be measured against the other. Comparing the novels fetched by servants for masters, in the ways that we saw yesterday, with the didactic fiction gifted by masters to servants, will reveal shared sentence level conventions, achieving different effects depending on whom they address and how explicitly they address them. Formally, I want to suggest in a moment, tracts distinguish the narrator's authority from the character's perspectives with which triple-deckers enmesh it. And that's just a way of saying the one thing that you do not find in tracts is free and direct discourse. Thematically, where 3-volume novels rented by masters portray a reading mind, that is, they're often quixotic in their themes, they represent what goes through a character's mind when she's reading. Tracts gifted to servants foreground more externally the act of accepting a piece of printed matter. And rhetorically, tracts match their subject to their audience instead of cueing readers to identify imaginatively across demographic lines. So full disclosure, I have just used a lot of big fancy words to acknowledge that these pamphlets are not for the purposes of any of the many interpretive operations that literary critics have spent generations sharpening on 3-volume Victorian realist fiction any good. Their content, though, can be played against the forms in which and rates at which their texts and paratexts survive. So my hope today is that comparing a pristine text block with a verbose paste down, that is, there's almost no marginalia, but there are a lot of inscriptions, or a giver's signature with a recipient's copying. So here you can see, I'll talk about this image in more detail in a few minutes, but the recipient copying the gift inscription verbatim. Or a gaudy reward binding with the world represented in its ineptly digitized pages can help us make sense of objects that bear witness to every possible textual operation, except reading. When we're faced with works that don't repay close reading or possibly any kind of reading at all, a literary critic's first refuge is usually a plot summary. But plot is one of the many pleasures, unfortunately, that tracts withhold. even the term career for them denotes a moral fall rather than a vocational ladder. So I'm thinking here of one that warns young footmen that few, I'm quoting, who enter the portals of temptation can stop short in their career. If you plotted, maybe that's the wrong word, if you represented visually what happens in these tracts, it would involve a kind of wave pattern of episodic ups and downs, rather than either the kind of downward slope of the seduction plot or the steady upward climb of the middle-class Victorian vocation plot. Plot in tracts is what happens to other people, to other characters. Pride goeth before a fall in the plotting heroine's juxtaposition with a minor character whose ambition leads to disgrace, disease, and death. The teenage protagonist enters no ballrooms. Instead, the story usually opens when she leaves her humble but happy cottage. The Bechdel test is aced by heroines who converse with a dying mother or a sententious cook, but there are almost no male characters. In those few cases where the employer isn't a maiden lady, of the kind, of course, who writes these tracts, the rule that the young master must either be not yet breached or already married and away from home makes warnings against bogus employment registries the closest tracts get to the world of a Pamela Andrews or a Tess Derbyfield. And of course, one of the many ways in which the plots, again, if I can use that word, of these tracts looks completely different from the socio-historical evidence is that sexual harassment is represented as something that occurs between jobs. It's the reason why you shouldn't leave your job, rather than as something that happens on the job, so that the call is never coming from inside the house for the purposes of their plots. An indulgent but spendthrift mistress who can no more be trusted than a Willoughby softens the protagonist to settle for a successor as dull and dependable as any Colonel Brandon. A giddy lady's maid who tempts the heroine to dream of a London situation becomes the closest thing to Flaubert's Rodolphe Boulanger or Trollope's Burgo Fitzgerald. Rewards scale down to match. When the remarkable history of Elizabeth Lovelace, a faithful servant, very interesting to all young persons, culminates in the protagonist's mistress rewarding her with several small sums, a seducer's pounds dwindle to pennies, like the price of the tract itself. It's a penny. Instead of rags to riches, these plots lead from rags to a decent stuff dress. The other big difference is that the departure from the family of origin that ends the middle-class courtship plot is where these tracts begin. The home of the home epic, in George Eliot's phrase, is never the protagonist's home, because the cottage where she grew up exists only in the backstory. For the teenager who spends a Bildungsroman learning to choose for herself, these telemachiads substitute a protagonist's gradual resignation to outsourcing her decisions to a fellow servant or to a mistress. And as for plot, so for focalization. To any Austen or Eliot reader, the form of these tracts appears at once uncannily familiar and bafflingly lacking. So that on the one hand, if you look at any individual sentence, they're third person, they're past tense, they're padded with detail, they're named after a pubescent protagonist. They look, if you look at them very closely, like those novels that we all know. But the warm fug of interiority stirred up by free and direct discourse gives way to parenthetical thought tags, thought I, says I. In some way, it's a Richardsonian world that keep a ginger distance from characters' consciousness. That spacing takes its starkest form in servants and places, or hasty removals with real examples. And this is, again, one of those plots that warns against throwing up a place for frivolous reasons. Its protagonist, when the stirring work of the day was over, could find no better employment for her leisure than to stand at the kitchen window and look out on the road. But here she might stand by the hour together and see only an old man going to the well to draw a pail of water, an old woman carrying out her grandchild, a boy leading a cow, 2 or 3 children at play, a pig running across the road, or a hen and her chickens scratching in the dust. So we've got here a kind of Dutch painting that is, from one point of view, recognizable to anyone who reads realist novels. But on the other hand, when the narrator adds that these sites would have been by no means devoid of interest to an intelligent observer, in retrospect, we reinterpret the only as a marker of something like free and direct discourse. That is, we now understand that it's the character rather than the narrator who's dismissing these details as unworthy of notice, except or until the repudiation of the consciousness through which the scene promises to be focalized shifts immediately to an external description of the narrator's standing and turning away. So there's a kind of zooming in and zooming out, which I think you can see more clearly if you compare it to a passage that some of you are probably thinking of already in Emma, where that ends, a mind lively and at ease. That is, Emma's mind in this case can do with seeing nothing. And of course, when you put these two passages side by side, at ease takes on a different meaning. That is, that Emma could spend all day looking out of the window if she wanted to, whereas Marianne will pretty soon need to go back to scrubbing the window panes. So that we're going to service focalizes through the counterfactual intelligent observer. Emma's is actually the consciousness through which the scene is focalized. And in fact, in going to service, the Mary Ann's own thoughts are crowded out immediately after this by an ending in which, thanks to her groundless discontent and refusal to put up with a life in which the only pleasure she has is once a day getting enough time to look out the window, she might daily be seen parading the streets after the soldier. So there, the zooming out completes. She's seen parading the streets, but she's not the seer. Listing the perceptual operations in which a character like Marianne doesn't engage makes visible how much a servant reading a tract is barred from extrapolating. Direct address, parenthetical explanation, signposting of exemplarity, parallels drawn between the fictional world and the reader's own. Each of these implicit instructions puts the reader in her endlessly eponymous place. The converse is that tracts don't cue their reader to put herself in someone else's. When the high church novelist Charlotte Young sets out to name this genre in 1869, the term that she ends up coining is class literature. And the first half of that compound conveys not just that these books are given as prizes in parish schools, and that literally they're a prize for attending class, but also that they define a class in the sense of a population. Instead of a one-size-fits-all, thou shalt not steal, what Young terms books for someone assume that The merchant must be edified by the tale of a fraudulent banker, the schoolboy by hearing how 7 cherries were stolen, the servants must be told how the wicked cook hid her mistress's ring in the innocent scullery maid's box. So 4 is the key here. Mid-length middlebrow fiction addressed to the middle classes hangs its subtitles on Of, a tale of Manchester life, a study of provincial life. Instead of announcing who the book is about, class literature makes explicit who it's for. Subject designations such as a tale in humble life and a domestic tale are outnumbered by audience labels. Doing service for the Lord, a tract for the servants' hall, 1850. Sunshine in the kitchen, or chapters for maidservants, Wesleyan Conference Office, 1872. And as we saw earlier, Lucy Bell's First Place, a story for domestics, My First Place and Other Stories adapted for servants. Some tracts even promote audience designation to title while shunting moral lesson to subtitle, as in the 1860 volume, Kind Words for the Kitchen or Pleasing One's Self. It's almost as if Middlemarch were to be subtitled, let's say, A Tale for Provincial Mistresses, except of course that is the very last book in the world that Rosamund Vincy would pick up. So tracts differ from triple deckers, not just in who they address, not just in how explicitly they name that audience, but also in how closely that audience matches the characters' rank, age, and gender. And with apologies for this slightly ungainly, swollen grimace square, because I am so old that I came up in the era where you put 4-part grids in your writing. You can see here that reading downward, so industrial fiction, social problem fiction, condition of England fiction, teaches a lesson in both senses of that word. It humbles, it chastens. Reading upward clocks escapism as expose. If you run a line along that diagonal, these are both forms of otherness. Sandwiched between them, tracts resemble triple-decker domestic fiction in setting their scene either in the same social sphere in which they're going to be read, or just a slight aspirational smidgen higher. Books for children, books for servants, books for poor men, poor women, poor boys, and poor girls, not to mention the merchant and the schoolboy. Young's otherwise exhaustive list omits only one term, which is middle-class adults. It's, in fact, her own readers, the readers of Macmillan's magazine. Over a century later, we still don't have any umbrella term that encompasses those fictions that appeared in 3 volumes rather than a pamphlet or single-volume reward book, with a subtitle that previewed content rather than naming an audience, and that were rented by commercial circulating libraries rather than sold for gifting. When the publisher Edward Lloyd explained that his publications, in his words, circulate amongst a class so different in education and social position, and these would be in quadrant 2, that we sometimes distrust our own judgment and place the manuscript in the hands of an illiterate person, a servant or machine boy, for instance, so we're back to Molière's cook, that social position is never named. In its place, all Lloyd substitutes is the sheer scale of 3 volumes. That is the only thing we know, the only definition of this class of people is that they read 3-volume novels. The vast majority of claims about Victorian fiction then and now take their examples from works produced for that unnamed readership. And to my mind, the most important current exception is a very fast-growing body of scholarship that traces the interplay between the Chartist press of Quadrant 2, and the middle class industrial fiction of Quadrant 3, that is, that traces a thematic line across audience divisions. Literary historians have inherited the Victorians' own tendency to take novels whose readers employed servants as the paradigmatic case. When Bruce Robbins's still definitive 1986 study of the servant's role in realist fiction, and I'm showing it to you here in my marked up copy, simply to say that it remains a fantastic and hugely important book. When Bruce Robbins contrasted what the novels say with what the history books say, he left out what fiction addressed to servants says. A decade later, even a critic as omnivorous as John Jordan could characterize Thackeray as the only Victorian novelist to write under servant pronouns. So the point here is not to fault them, but to say that reading from the other side of the mass digitization projects that have made so many of these volumes available makes clear that even fiction produced for middle class, middlebrow readers, I think it makes more sense when you read it against the competing genres against which it was at the time defined. And the first way in which reading these two genres together is that class literature or tracts reveal the triple-decker reader's power to rove among different consciousnesses as a positional good. That is, it makes clear that the prestige of free and direct discourse, the moral prestige of free and direct discourse, depends in part on its unavailability to poorer readers, not in the sense of incompetent readers, but of economically disadvantaged readers. Because this model of empathy locates prestige less in the right to speak for oneself than in the standing to speak for the other, the promiscuous focalization that invites readers to empathize across social ranks ends up enshrining their mastery. In accusing the endeavor to hold up a mirror to his or her way of life, of narrowing and weakening the reader of tracts, Charlotte Young makes an uncharacteristically egalitarian plea for servants' right to engage in the same outward-facing reading to which their masters have access. Where ladies who think themselves into the mind of a triple-decker's protagonist expand or even escape their own perceptual field, the tract buttonholes its readers by pigeonholing its characters. So if the novel is not romance, the novel defined against the romance teaches masters, in George Eliot's words, to feel the pains and joys of those who differ from themselves. The tract as not novel rubs servants' noses into their lack of standing to imagine the other. Narrowing may explain why, when a friend asked Young to recommend a book for future maids, Young's answer, and I quote from her letter, was, "The less it is about servants, the better they like it." But a more extrinsic reason may be the tract's disjunction of buyer from end user. As I've discussed at tedious length elsewhere, volume discounts for bulk purchases invite upper-class middlewomen to give away multiple copies of each tract, so that as late as 1873, for example, you can see in the third listing here, Partridge producing Mrs. Sherwood's Waste Not, Want Not, a book for servants in both a cloth edition priced at 1 and 6, and for servants to buy, and a gilt edition whose 2 and 6 price made it likelier to be given as a school leaving reward. Tracts themselves represent books being received more often than books being read. While the class literature of Quadrant 4 shares the realist novel's hostility to romance, its plots lack the quixotic motif that runs through upmarket fiction as otherwise varied as the three novels you see here, Emma, the Doctor's Wife, and Middlemarch. One explanation is that tracts subordinate the author's seduction of the reader to the giver's power over the receiver. The Servants' Magazine for 1855 is typical in describing a mistress asking her maid, "How came you by this book?" before rapidly glancing through its contents. So here, as I suggested at the beginning, we don't see the servant reading. We see the maid, we see the mistress reading in order to imagine how the servant is reading. Declaring that "I have always provided my servants with amusing and instructive books," the mistress adds that no grocer should lend a young person such an idle and worthless story. The speed with which the never quoted or even summarized pages are glanced through contrasts with the density of verbs devoted to transmission. "How came you by the book? I have always provided my servants with books." No grocer should lend a young person such a book. In fact, narrators rarely name what their characters read, let alone summarize it. Instead of specifying the title or even the genre of the book that drives its protagonist astray, letters of counsel to young servants, illustrated by anecdotes founded upon facts, apologies for the quality of the slide, mentions only that Maggie had taken another person's book to read without first asking permission. She now ventured to conceal the books she took to read in her box. So the problem seems to be not the content of the book, but the way the servant comes by it and the fact that she goes on to hide it. Likewise, when an article in the Servants' Magazine warns against books brought to the back door in gentlemen's houses. The genre of the book isn't specified, but the way they enter the house is. Again, the Servants' Magazine in 1853 professes itself shocked to see the newspapers that have found their way into kitchens and thence into the hands of readers who refuse to obtain from your mistress some nice, useful book, so that the newspapers are actually promoted to the grammatical subject. The servant becomes the object, but the dangerous mobility of the newspaper or the book that finds its way in through the same back door by which food scraps for resale leave becomes a kind of figure for the overly mobile servant who keeps leaving jobs or who fantasizes about getting a better one. One publisher's advertisement describes a collection of household tracts for the people as designed as gifts from parents to their children, teachers to their scholars, mistresses to their servants, and masters to their workpeople. All that links these otherwise disparate groups of dependents is the fact that it is harder to count as a buyer than as a reader. In extending to servants, Matthew Grenby's observation that children challenge modern understandings of the reader as a voluntary and independent consumer who selects and acquires what he or she wishes to read, tracts demote that norm to a special case, to a quantitative outlier. What's interesting about this for our field, I think, is that household circulation challenges a historiography that prefers personal channels to the cash nexus. When Ronald and Mary Bourret describe friends or family members' informal loans and gifts of books becoming, and here I'm quoting them, enriched with specific social meanings, the loaded term, the positive term, obscures how many genres opposed giving to loving. And I think this becomes particularly clear if you contrast tracts with the slave narratives being produced in a not unrelated religious context on the other side of the Atlantic, celebrating the freedom expressed by reading, whereas class literature makes reading and print and owning books especially a vector of deference. The radically independent reading chronicled in Jonathan Rose's 2018 manifesto, Reader's Liberation, finds its antonym in tracts designed to prompt acceptance, which I mean in every sense of that word. Now, there may be a simpler reason that characters aren't represented reading tracts, which is that nobody did. Surviving copies will disappoint any scholar scanning for marginal marks. Those few signs of life that huddle in the front face down rarely include servants' own traces. The place where owners would have signed upmarket books is filled in tracts by what we might call, if we backform from ownership inscriptions, givership inscriptions. Whatever the proportion of printed blanks to manuscript names, these domestic or institutional records foreground by whom the book was donated, where, when, and why, in this case, for very regular attendance. This is a book that I find puzzling and fascinating. It's a collection of poems selected for the kitchen fireside. You can see in a firm pen presented to, I think it's to Maggie Ellen. I can't read, someone here I hope can, the last word. And then you can see someone copying over those words in a way that seems almost diametrically opposed to the classic middle-class child's ownership inscription. Steal not this book for fear of life, the owner carries a 2-cent knife, and so forth. Because here the owner is not asserting herself, she's ventriloquizing the giver, becoming the giver's copyist. And you could say the same of characters in tracts. The heroine of Little Millie and Her Four Places, for example, is given a beautiful book of travels with "From Cousin Hal" written on the flyleaf. And that's all we find out about the book that she gets as a present. So we don't know what the book is called. We don't know what it's about, other than that it's about travels. We don't read over her shoulder any farther. By quoting handwritten inscriptions while refusing to quote printed matter, the narrator reduces a mass-produced multiple to something like an inside-out envelope. And I think of these books as a little bit like those tchotchkes you can buy at the mall, where the point is not the tchotchke, it's the fact that it's monogrammed. It's the memorialization of the gift transaction. And I think this is something that I don't have a slide, I should, that Leslie Howsam is very interesting on in the context of Bibles as gift objects. And in some ways, the culture of tract giving is an extension of that, but with the difference that everyone already has a Bible, so you can still inflict tracts upon them in great numbers. As so often, the scarcity of evidence implies a superabundance of explanations. Pristine margins may reflect reverence or contempt, may stem from the need to work rather than study, or may, on the contrary, hold over from having been schooled to treat books gingerly. And it is striking that when characters in tracts are represented owning books, good characters. They're often described covering the books in making a paper cover for the books, or covering them in a neat wash leather case. And in one kind of pathetic example, a tract, an 1814 tract by Sarah Trimmer, there's this pathetic moment where the servant character has essentially just been saved by this tract, and the narrator hints that the character is about to start crying, but instead of full-blown tears, the narrator simply says that she dropped a tear of joy on the cover, which she wiped away with her hand, that it might do no injury. So even the tears are seen as a mark of dirt that the servant needs to clean, rather than as a mark of emotion. And the two kind of poles of explanation that I've mentioned, either that people didn't mark these up because they were too boring, or that people didn't mark them up because they were too beautiful, are not, we all know, mutually exclusive. What neither of them explains is why the plots of tracts don't represent mistresses reading either. Far from contrasting a literate mistress with an unlettered maid, Anne Taylor's present of a mistress to a young servant, and endlessly reprinted after 1816, points out that the very page that is in front of us now might have remained unread if it were not for, and I quote Taylor here, those ladies who, instead of spending their Sunday in pleasure, as many do, or at any rate in enjoying themselves and their books at home, devote their time to teaching Sunday school. So here you can see class-specific fears of sedition giving way to a kind of equal opportunity suspicion of literacy, where it is better to spend Sunday teaching Sunday school than it is to read to yourself at home. That is, it's better to engage face-to-face. Sometimes even a mistress who appears to be reading turns out to be performing for the benefit of a servant. As Mrs. Motherly, whose name is up there with William Kitchener, explains in the Servant's Behavior book, or Hints on Manners and Dress for Maidservants in Small Households, 1859, I know many ladies who have repented of having spoken familiarly to their servants, finding that the girls have misunderstood their kindness, and sometimes have gone so far as to begin talking about their own affairs in the drawing room. One lady who was thus annoyed told me that she always took up a book and appeared to read before she rang the bell, hoping thus to keep the girl from stopping to talk when she came up. Where this mistress picks up her own book in order to send a nonverbal message to the maid, there's evidence that more godly mistresses genuinely did scan tracts in order to select servants' reading. Such a mistress can predict what words might baffle or what plots might alienate the tract's recipient only by suspending her own identity for the time it takes to skim. As laboriously as any book reviewer or sales rep, the mistress develops a theory of mind by trying on a set of tastes defined against her own. Now, it might be a stretch to compare the pleasure that reactionary mistresses took in guessing recipients' reaction to tracts with the pleasure that reform-minded intellectuals of the same social class, or at least of the same income level, took in empathizing with the protagonists of industrial fiction. What does seem fair to say is that each trusts print to bridge a gulf. Where literary identification grants access to characters' minds, what we might call extratextual identification invites readers more recursively to imagine the responses, to imagine or to predict the responses of other readers. And where reading to marked social difference, as when in one direction the master of a family reads prayers to the household, or in the other direction, the servant reads aloud to the master or mistress. Reading for shaded into reading as, perhaps even by extension, seeing through the eyes not of a represented character, but of a fantasized reader. How can a middle-class housewife understand other minds? Victorians filed that question not under psychology or literary theory, but as a component of the servant problem. My comparison between tract giving and novel reading, however speculative, does square with one household manual's advice to practice your powers of identification on the maid. Imagine yourselves at times to be in the servant's place. Judge of their feelings by what your own would be in their situation. H.G. Watkins's hints addressed to heads of families advises. In this pragmatic adaptation of a spiritual exercise, the imitatio Christi gives way to a psychological experiment. Watkins calls this an experiment, which changes situation and place from a term that for servants designates a job to mean a fuzzier sense of something like a social station. The glimpse of otherness that husbands could achieve through sexual or professional encounters may genuinely have taken the form of cohabitation with domestics. But you're not alone if you're wondering whether Watkins got things backwards when he speculated about who was doing the work of identifying with whom. When Elizabeth Banks, the fin de siècle American journalist whom we encountered yesterday, went undercover to report on the lives of London domestics, her takeaway was that to be a good parlor maid, you must be a mind reader. Banks's textual metaphor would go on to be echoed by the actual maid who responded to Violet Butler's 1916 survey for the Women's Industrial Council by complaining that ladies do not study servants as servants study them. At a moment when debates about raising the school leaving age framed reading as a competitor to work, comparing the mistress's mind to a textbook casts one as a training ground for the other. Butler's activism repurposes as servant survival skills the epistemological virtues with which tract distribution vests mistresses. The perspective taking that amuses the middle-class novel reader or sanctifies the middle-class tract giver burdens the servant. If for textual purposes, the tract giver who pre-screens resembles the mistress who sees through the eyes of fictional characters, a more material taxonomy would assimilate mistresses who force tracts on their maids to maids who fetch triple-deckers for their mistresses. Yet the subset of housewives involved in the first transaction is unlikely to coincide much with those in the second, for the simple reason that ladies serious-minded enough to distribute tracts were underrepresented in, though never absent from, the audience for fashionable fiction. Even the faith made public by the proprietor of the circulating library, this is a shout out to Jerry's introduction last night that gained a near monopoly on 3-volume fiction, took the form of lobbying against certain words and plot points more often than of positive steps to stock godly fiction, and certainly not tracts. The relativism that underpins Victorian realism's call to think across demographic lines or to feel across demographic lines resisted being co-opted by Anglican fiction, which never came to dominate upper middle class distribution channels, no matter how hard innovators like Young tried. Those same realist novels bequeathed literary critics names for the first order process of picturing oneself inside the world conjured up by a text. If we still lack names for the second order process by which texts nudge each reader to speculate about others, one explanation is that religious tracts probed the ethics of that task more systematically than did psychological fiction. Yet by enlisting trivial genres in strenuous imaginative exercises, both serious pleasures, I'm borrowing Carolyn Levine's phrase here, invested books with the power to domesticate social difference. I began these lectures yesterday with a former maid's account of feeling placed on the bottom shelf. I didn't mention yesterday that Winifred Foley's memoir ends in the 1930s with her marriage to a fellow radical whom she picked up at an anti-fascist rally while working as a domestic in London. The fussiness of the mistress who required Foley to bang the dust from her books is thrown into relief by the kindness of the Jewish family as whose shiksa Foley identifies herself. The appearance of that Yiddish-derived word in a text otherwise at pains to memorialize her own rural speech community marks the ex-servant's attempt to see herself from the eyes of her soon-to-become vulnerable employers, less instrumentally than in the mind reading that, according to Banks and Violet Butler's informant, ward off being fired. The solidarity forged by trying on a different language reverses the stigma of being named on the title page of a tract. Temporary buyer and permanent owner, reward sticker filler and prize book owner, paste down inscriber who pre-reads, and paste down addressee unable or unwilling to read at all. The asymmetrical knowledge generated by these exchanges made the tract a vector for inequalities never reducible to more or less access to a print commodity or more or less right to gain literacy. That text-adjacent knowledge shaped the lives of servants who neither chose nor bought tracts, and of mistresses who neither owned tracts nor recognized themselves in their audience, suggests how far the effects of print reside in its movement through unequal households. Thank you. And maybe we'll start with questions from the room. Oh, thank you.
Any questions from the room? Here.
Thank you. Can you comment more on the exclusion of tracts for young male servants?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are some more earlier in the century, and I think some of that probably just reflects the changing proportions of male and female servants. That is, there are fewer male servants as the century progresses. I suspect that some of it lies in the feminization of fiction in general, which I know is endlessly debated, and the evidence on that is inconclusive. But to the extent that there was at least a belief that both fiction reading and fiction writing are feminine. So I think some of it has to do with the fictional mode. Some of it has to do with, the sheer number of targets for this kind of distribution. Some of it, I suspect, has to do with the production side, which is what we know about the authors of these things is very uneven. But what we do know suggests that the vast majority of writers were ladies. Mm-hmm. So I think there may be something problematic about that kind of cross-gendered advice giving. And this is I have no evidence for this, but I suspect that they didn't think that they would take them. Yeah. But I don't have evidence for that, and I don't know what form that evidence.
And just a follow-up question. I mean, you've referred to the parish schools where the young girls are being trained. Are they co-educational or are they single sex?
So they are I mean, there is also parish education for boys, but they are divided, and that is that's interesting because it's true that boys are also in some cases being given reward books for attendance. Boys are, I have found significantly fewer reward books, attendance reward books inscribed to boys, but there are many, I'm sure you can think of many explanations for that that would not necessarily involve them getting fewer of these. But I don't think it's just that. I do think that it also has to do with the stigma involved in highly demographically specific forms of address. That is, when boys are getting, when I've found reward books inscribed to boys, they're not about your future life and service. They're adventure stories, they're naval stories, they're and I don't think that they're specifically for boys who are actually going to sea in the same way that these books for girls are for girls who are actually going to service. So I think that it's possible that in the same way that middle-class people are not expected to put up with books that are explicitly addressed to them as middle-class people, that boys are not being explicitly addressed as boys, even though in another sense, we know that cross-reading is asymmetrical, and that then is now girls read more boys' books than boys read girls' books. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. I thought that was fascinating. And I also found it sort of sobering in the sense that you really pull back from so many of the sort of optimistic narratives about the circulation of books. So I'm just going to ask a really sort of non-bibliographic style question here, which is, I mean, I'm curious to know if you think things have changed in that sense, because I couldn't help sort of think of all of the times in my life when I've, wanted to give books to someone who's cleaned a house for me or looked after my children, or simply exists in a sort of parallel class world, and where I've stumbled over that as something that is incredibly difficult when it shouldn't be. It should be, I mean, as people who, as you put it, are so normed into thinking about what other people think, we should be in the strongest of positions to share the very form that has trained us in those kinds of cross-class thinking. And yet some of those moments of gifting books have been the most awkward for me in my sort of existence as someone who thinks about class position all the time. And I also, just to throw another narrative out there, I was also thinking about, I mean, not tracts, but these little sort of cheap, books that you get on the counter of the sort of Borders bookshop where, it's Adichie's Why We Should All Be Feminists, or Amanda Gorman's poem. And I remember my daughter at one moment of her sort of high school graduation career getting 3 of these kind of copies of Adichie's Why We Should All Be Feminists from well-meaning aunts and people who I'm sure aren't feminists, but felt that this was exactly the right moment to sort of give this young niece the sort of the book that somehow takes the form, I think, of the tract in our sort of modern commodity circuits for these sort of advice-laden books. So I'll leave it there. You can answer any or all of that as you wish.
So I have either a anecdotal answer or well, okay, I'll give both answers. But I'm trying to think which I should give first. Okay, the non-first person answer is that I think in a way your question answers Jerry's question in the sense that I think part of the difference is that boys and men are not, when you read working class autobiographies, which are obviously atypical in so many ways, women's tend to, or female servants at least, tend to talk about the books that they received as gifts. Or in some cases about the books, a treasured book that they received, not from an employer, but from their mother or from a friend, a husband. Whereas men's autobiographies tend to talk about the books of which they took possession, the books that they seized for themselves. So that on the one hand, you have the narrative of the female servant receiving the book as a gift from the mistress. On the other hand, you have the narrative of the male worker picking up the master's newspaper and gaining political consciousness through that. So that might parallel the contrast that I drew yesterday between the printing press on the stage in the Birmingham Chartist rally in 1851 on the one hand, and on the other hand, the claustrophobic world of the kitchen where the mistress is giving the book to the servant and kind of standing over her. So yeah, I think that maybe a better answer to your question than the one I gave, Jerry, would be that maybe the difference is not specific to books, it's about gifting. It's about the gendering of the gift and the way that boys are empowered to go out and rob the apple tree, and girls are expected to wait and take the thing that is given to them. The first person answer, which your work emboldens me to give a first person answer, Tina, is, and this is very free associative, is that I was once as I think maybe early adolescent, taken by my grandmother to a bookstore, or no, I think it was in fact when I graduated from high school. And she said, my grandmother, knowing that I was already then a person who, unlike what you said in your introduction yesterday, Jerry, is very picky about the books I read, my grandmother was afraid to choose a book to give me as a gift. So very nicely, she took me to the bookstore, the very small, the not very good bookstore in the town where she lived, and said, I don't want to give you a book. I don't know what you like. Choose anything in the bookstore. And I spent around an hour looking around the bookstore, and finally I said, I don't want anything here. And it's also crazy because she said, there are thousands of books in the bookstore. How is it that you don't want any of them? And I said, well, some of them are books that I like, but those are ones that I own already. So that's just to say that it's the cliche is that giving someone a gift is a burden because, well, as Schopenhauer says, you can't give them the time in which they can read the book. But I don't think it's just about the expectation that they'll read it. I also think it's about, it's like the way when you give someone a gift of clothes, you are telling them what size you think they wear. It's, you're telling them who they are. And part of what feels so, one of the ways in which these tracts counteract so many of the, as you say, kind of progressive narratives that we tell ourselves about the book then and now, is that it's as if they're placing the reader, they are boxing in the reader whether or not they are making demands on, not the reader, the owner, even if they aren't making demands on the owner's time, even if they aren't demanding to be read, they are nonetheless defining the recipient as a certain kind of person. And part of what seems to be at stake in the asymmetry between tracts and realist novels is that the realist novel tells you you can be someone else. You can choose who to be, and they're telling you this is who you are, and this is the only person you can be. And for me, that's what makes them, it's not that they're heartbreaking because they're boring, they're low quality. I mean, they are boring and low quality, but it's because of that sense of force.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. I really appreciated in this talk and in the answer to your questions, talking about how, book giving, as you're saying, even historically says far more about the book giver and their assumptions than the book receiver's reading. And to follow on that, I was just really struck by your observation that most of them are episodic in nature in their plots, rather than any sort of like cohesive narrative arc of a Bildungsroman or a seduction narrative. And I was just wanted to invite you to talk a little bit more about what the assumptions are behind that episodic genre, not just in terms of plot, but also maybe like in terms of sort of what type of forms of reading are imagined of the servant, because it does seem like you could have part of the reason I was thinking is, could you have a more cohesive narrative arc which tells the same sort of didactic story? And is the episodic nature just because of the genre, or because of it's inseparable from the content, or is it saying something about what type of reading or forms of reading are imagined, or readerly attention? So very open. I'm just really curious about the episodic part.
Yeah, are you suggesting that they're episodic because they would have been read in short bursts because that would have been the amount of time that someone in this situation had for reading?
Yeah, that's sort of what I'm curious about. Like if it's not supposed to be pulling the reader through too much, or something about being easily reread, or fragmented. Yeah, I'm not really sure because I haven't read this genre, but yeah.
What you're saying is making me realize that they're one of the few genres that are not by and large serialized. So they're not broken into pieces that way. There are a few exceptions, but magazines that explicitly address servants, of which there are several, by and large, for fiction, publish short stories rather than serializing what would be, when collected, full-length fiction. Yeah, the chapter is an important unit in them. It's usually one place, one chapter. But the lack of a narrative arc goes with, I think, both a thematic suspicion of ambition, a rhetorical suspicion of pleasure. These are not supposed to be too exciting or too stimulating. There's often a kind of gesture toward plottedness that works a little bit the way it does in the Radcliffean version of the Gothic, so that often one of the main microgenres, which Young alludes to in when she makes fun of the story where the wicked cook hides the ring in the virtuous servant's box, one of the main microgenres is the story in which the protagonist is accused of having done something which she didn't do, but which turns out to have been indirectly enabled by something that she did do. So I mean, it's usually something like a burglar steals the plate. She's accused of having opened the window to the burglar, and it turns out the other servant, the one who wants to be a lady, opened the window to the burglar. But the reason the other servant was able to open the window to the burglar is that the protagonist, left the ladder standing in the wrong place or something like that. So, I mean, in a way, it's like the relation, the classic relation between the two sisters or the two female doubles in the realist novel. It's like Elizabeth Bennet and Lydia Bennet. There's the kind of desire projected onto the other character. So there's a sort of shadow plot where you can imagine the other character having indeed this very exciting trajectory, both the fantasized exciting trajectory of becoming a lady, and then the real sharp downward slope of she's being dragged off for theft. But the protagonist's life is more even. So in fact, I mean, your question is helping me see that maybe episodic, I shouldn't use the word episodic, because the events don't even rise to the level of episodes. So thank you for that.
Take one from the Q&A. Jeff Barton's asking, did you say that tract lit generally has no reader marks or far fewer than non-tract fiction? If so, can you give any numbers on the ratios of each, i.e. a percentage of each type of literature inscribed by readers? And also about your semi-sizes, just curious, thanks.
Sorry, about my, is it sample sizes? With
I
a
think
typo,
it's
maybe?
sample sizes, a P is missing.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Jeff Barton. I wish I had an answer. I don't. That is, I myself have found zero marginalia in tracts, but that proves nothing. And I don't know I don't know what the competing accounts of the proportion of, let's say, middle-class addressed fiction in various formats that has marginalia would be. If someone here has a take on that, I'd be very interested, or someone on the Zoom. Sample size, also very unsystematic, a couple of hundred tracts, which is not a lot, although it feels like a lot when you're reading them.
I've been trying to formulate a question about time since yesterday. One of the quotes that you shared about the servant's time not being her own, and that the sort of sin was, consuming her mistress's time. And then again, the sort of servant who's sort of whimsically kind of looking out the window, and then just now this question about sort of the episodic nature, and your initial response that maybe it was, addressed to people who did not have free time. And I just, so I don't have a question about it, but I feel like it's a theme that's worth sort of, I don't know, pulling at a little bit more. To what extent is there something going on here about the sort of anxieties around free time and an effort to assert control over the limited free time that a servant class had, relative to the other things they might be reading? It just seems to me like a theme worth sort of probing even more deeply. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but thank you.
No, that's helpful. I mean, the basic answer would be that domestic servants, I think, compare even relative to other people at the same income level, it's not just that they don't have a lot of time, they don't know when they're going to have that time. That is, their time is quite unpredictable. So they may have snatches of time, but it's hard to know when those snatches will come. That differs among different kinds of service. And clearly coming back to the gender question, footmen notoriously do have time because they're sitting around waiting. Whereas many other categories of domestic service, in particular, they both don't have time to read, and they have so little time to sleep that they're very unlikely to have energy for reading, let alone for, coming back to Jeff Barton's question, for annotating, or the logistical setup to annotate. I'd say there are also questions about the lack of division, simply the fact that they're living in. Obviously, they're not the only occupational category. They're one of many occupational categories that are living in. But, I've thought sometimes about whether the kind of argument that Rancière makes in Knights of Labor is relevant to this work. And to me, it seems it's like a foreign country. There's no sense of division between the servant's work life and imaginative life. There's no sense of division between work and leisure. It's all kind of temporally muddled together, except for the day out or the afternoon out, which does not seem to be spent reading, partly for spatial reasons. So yeah, time. None of these tracts use the phrase time theft, but that's very much the logic of what a lot of the household manuals talk about. I've talked someplace else about the case of a servant, the account of a servant in an narrative narrated by a Bible, a servant who pulls the Bible down from the shelf while dusting it, opens it to servants obey in all things your masters, and puts it back as if it were burning. So there, I think that's the clearest example of that time, the time at which the book is read trumps the content of the book. Even the Bible, if it's read at the wrong time, is a problem. But yeah, I'm not sure how to disentangle the time question from the, coming back to what you mentioned in your introduction, Whitney, the question of energy, the question of reading from the question of sleep. So yeah, it's an important question.
And I've got a couple more. Let me do these quick ones and then we'll take the last one from the floor. Okay, I've got two quick questions. One from Cheryl Thurber asking, were religious tracts used to teach literacy along with religious messages? And I'll do the second one. And Elizabeth Young, in terms of pamphlets that you mentioned, were these pamphlets primarily advertising pamphlets that were also guidebooks for help?
Got it. Thank you both for those questions. As in, if I understand the question, was there cross advertising between fictional tracts and how-to and how-to manuals? Occasionally, but by and large, they're treated as separate genres. So this might come back to your question yesterday, Lynn, about the relation between cookbooks. In other words, there's a pretty sharp generic differentiation between cookbooks and other household manuals that involve practical knowledge, conduct books that involve moral and religious exhortation, and tracts which fictionalize the moral and religious exhortation. And apologies, could you repeat
Yeah.
Cheryl Thurman's question?
The first one was, were religious tracts used to teach literacy
Oh.
along with religious messages?
Thank you. I believe, I would say not, because they're given as we would say, the capstone. They're the end, they're school leaving books rather than school textbooks. They presume a fairly high level of literacy. I mean, they're put them next to the realist novel. They look literarily unsophisticated. Put them next to most forms of print. Put them next to an almanac. They, again, at the sentence level, complex sentences, a lot of subordination and coordination. The vocabulary is not that simple, which again may be another reason why there's not a lot of marginalia in them. They may just have been mismatched to the population. But I think we have a question in the room.
So maybe my question builds on what Sean was talking about a little bit. If I am a mistress and I have a new servant and I'm not her first house, can I give her like Lucy's first place? Like how prescriptive is this? Or if I'm a lady who's writing these tracts, like why would I ever write one that's like Lucy finally finds the house where she's happy to work for the rest of her life? And is there any like Lucy grows old in this place and is well cared for in her, final years? Or is it just about, this fresh, I just finished, Lucy just finishes school and enters her first place kind of fiction?
So I think you've just defined a genre that you could in which you could be a trailblazer. So yeah, a few answers. One is that I think the literary answer would be that these tracts use what in a different context, in the context of 18th century fiction, Stephanie Hirschenow calls the novice. In her wonderful recent book, Born Yesterday, Hirschenow talks about this, the centrality of this figure of the girl who doesn't yet know. So in that sense, I think that's one of the motifs that these tracts share with upmarket fiction. And in some ways, it's analogous to the classic question about the courtship novel. Why are all the novels about courtship and not about marriage? The question that literary critics have been asking for, 50 or 60 years, right? Like, why is it always beginnings rather than middles? The more socio-historical answer might be that Lucy's not going to have a comfortable retirement. That sort of, like many forms of wearing physical work, service wears people down. They become much less employable the older they get. And if they don't marry out of service, female servants in particular tend to have a pretty lousy old age. And then the ideological reason might be that your first job is supposed to be your last job. And in that sense, it is a little bit like the version of the courtship novel that's about settling, that it's about not fantasizing about a different mistress, but rather learning to find some kind of modus vivendi with the mistress who you do have. But I also think maybe a simpler explanation than any of those would be that readers of whatever age were interested in teenagers in a way that, regardless of their own age, that's who stories are about. And so, one of the many ways in which this genre takes off of Pamela, which is more or less explicitly invoked in a lot of these tracts or ripped off in a lot of these tracts. It's I think it's in Clarissa that Richardson says, the period of a young person's life from, what is it, something like 16 to 22, that's when things happen. And it's the moment of leaving the home. The odd thing about that in tracts is just that it's not leaving the home. It's not, as in the middle class courtship novel, leaving your parents' home to start your own home. It's leaving your home to become a dependent. It's going from being a dependent in your father's house to being a dependent in a mistress's house. So it's more of the same.
With that, I'd like to thank Leah Price for a wonderful second lecture. And we'll be back here on Thursday. And those of you who can join us tomorrow, Wednesday at 10 a.m. in the Lee Library, we will have an informal seminar and chat about some more of these really fascinating topics. Thank you.